He wasn't supposed to live. His entire unit, Falcon Echo, was erased in a single night, wiped out so completely that the military tried to pretend they never existed at all. But one black soldier refused to die where he was meant to be forgotten. Bleeding, hunted, and alone in a valley designed to bury every secret inside it. Sergeant Jalen Ward crawled out of a massacre that was never meant to have a survivor. And the truth he carried would shake the very system that sent his brothers to die. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more powerful and emotional black soldier stories like this one, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from. Your support keeps these untold stories alive. The valley wasn't on any official map, not the real ones anyway. To most of the world, it was an empty patch of wilderness somewhere between unremarkable hills and nameless ridges. But to Falcon Echo, the elite reconnaissance unit chosen for a classified operation, it was the destination of a mission wrapped in secrecy, so suffocating that even seasoned soldiers felt the weight of it pressing on their shoulders. Sergeant Jalen Ward stood at the head of the formation, watching the sunrise spill slowly across the rocky terrain. The colors looked wrong. Too pale, too cold, as if the light itself hesitated to touch the valley ahead. His men joked quietly behind him, masking their nerves with forced laughter, but Jalen felt the unease deep in his bones. He had learned to trust that feeling long ago. Instinct wasn't something the military issued, trained, or explained. It was something carved into him from childhood, sharpened through every fight, every survival, every mission that demanded more than human endurance. And today, his instinct whispered only one thing. Something here is wrong. The briefing they received that morning had been unusually thin. Command claimed Falcon Echo was being deployed to investigate a possible insurgent hideout. But Jalen had seen the satellite images, blurred, incomplete, blank in places where there should have been terrain. The intel officer offering the briefing avoided eye contact with every difficult question, repeating the same rehearsed lines. Minimal resistance expected. No known enemy strongholds. Simple reconnaissance and extraction. Yet, the deployment orders contradicted everything. They were sending in Falcon Echo, the kind of unit used for crises, not routine checks. And they were sending them with suppressed weapons, limited communication channels, and no backup. It didn't add up. Jalen watched his men gear up with a heaviness in his chest. These weren't rookies. These were brothers forged in fire, men who had survived ambushes, sieges, and missions where they'd been outnumbered 100-1. But courage didn't change reality. The valley felt wrong, too still, too quiet, too untouched by life. As they approached the valley entrance, wind brushed against their uniforms with a strange coldness, carrying no scent of vegetation or soil, only a faint metallic tang that made Jalen's breath hitch. He paused at the ridge, scanning the vast expanse below. No birds, no insects, no sign of movement. It was as if the valley had been abandoned by nature itself. Lieutenant Cross, standing beside him, forced a grin. Maybe the wildlife didn't get the memo. Jalen didn't smile. Or maybe they did, he murmured. Something in the valley's silence felt intentional, like a held breath waiting for the moment they stepped into its jaws. Behind him, the unit tightened formation, each man aware, whether they admitted it or not, that something unseen was studying them. Jalen exhaled slowly, steadying his nerves as he signaled the advance. He felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. Falcon Echo trusted him. They believed he could see danger before it struck. But as they crossed into the valley, the air thickened, and the world seemed to shift. And deep in his gut, Jalen knew the truth. They were entering a place that didn't want witnesses, and his instinct had never been louder. The deeper Falcon Echo moved into the valley, the more the world seemed to suffocate around them. What should have been a routine approach through sparse woodland turned into a silent march through terrain that felt stripped of life. Jalen scanned the surroundings with a soldier's practiced eye, searching for the small signs that normally revealed a living ecosystem. Bird nests tucked along branches, animal tracks in the dirt, the distant hum of insects. But there was nothing. Even the wind seemed to avoid the valley floor, dying into a stillness that made every footstep sound unnaturally loud. The men noticed it too. Conversations faded. Jokes stopped. Silence settled in their ranks until all that remained was the sound of boots pressing into brittle soil. Lieutenant Cross tapped his comms unit, frowning. "Ward, you getting anything?" Jalen checked his own device. The signal bar flickered, weak, inconsistent. "Just static," he replied. That wasn't normal. They were nowhere near mountainous terrain yet, and the valley wasn't supposed to interfere with communication. But the radios hissed like something was smothering the signal. They continued deeper. The first odd sign appeared near a dried riverbed. A series of footprints, too many and too scattered to belong to a comm patrol. Jalen knelt down, running his fingers across the dirt. The prints looked fresh, but the patterns were frantic. Men running, stumbling, shifting direction abruptly. "Not ours," he whispered. Cross crouched beside him. "Insurgents." Jalen shook his head. "If they were insurgents, they'd know this terrain. These prints are from people fleeing." He stood and scanned the edges of the valley again, feeling a slow formation of dread settle between his shoulders. Something had driven another unit through here recently. And whatever that something was, the military had failed to mention it in their briefing. As they moved on, they encountered torn fabric caught on a broken tree limb, military camouflage, American issue. Jalen's jaw tightened. "Command said no one was deployed here before us?" Cross muttered, a tremor of disbelief in his voice. Jalen didn't respond. The fabric told the truth, not the briefing. Someone had been here, and someone hadn't come back. Far ahead, the valley stretched into a wide bowl-shaped depression, its slopes dotted with rocky outcrops that offered ideal positions for snipers or ambushes. Yet no movement appeared, not even the rustle of leaves. The emptiness felt staged, like the valley was pretending to be harmless. Jalen raised a fist, halting the unit. He felt a prickle at the back of his neck, the instinct he had learned never to ignore. Before he could speak, Corporal Hughes pointed upward. "Sir, look." Jalen followed his gaze and saw a communications tower on a distant ridge, collapsed, twisted, and blackened as if it had been struck by a blast. But there were no scorch marks on the surrounding trees. No debris patterns suggesting an explosion. It looked melted. Cross exhaled sharply. What could do that? Jalen didn't have an answer, but his heartbeat quickened. A tower meant for long-range broadcasting had collapsed without any official report, and their own radios were failing inside this valley. Jalen stepped forward, feeling the valley's silence tighten like a noose. The men followed, and as Falcon Echo descended further, the static in his radio deepened, and then, with a soft click, died entirely. The valley had severed their last link to the outside world, and now they were truly alone. The further Jalen led Falcon Echo down the valley, the more the landscape transformed into something that looked less like a battlefield and more like the aftermath of a disappearance. The soil grew darker, disturbed in patches that suggested dragging rather than walking. Bushes lay crushed in irregular shapes, as if bodies had been thrown into them with violent force. A set of tire tracks cut through the dirt, yet ended abruptly in the middle of nowhere, as if the vehicle had simply vanished. Jalen crouched beside the tracks, running a hand over the dirt. No signs of turning, no signs of braking, no explosión, just an abrupt stop. Cross knelt beside him, confusion tightening his brow. How does a truck just stop existing? Jalen didn't answer. There was no answer that didn't lead somewhere bad. He signaled the men to spread out, eyes sharp, weapons raised. "Stay tight. Eyes up." They moved slowly, checking every angle as they approached what looked like the remnants of an old forward operating outpost, one that had clearly been abandoned long before Falcon Echo arrived. The sandbags were torn open and rotting. The metal frames of makeshift barricades were bent inward. A shattered helmet lay half-buried in the dirt. Jalen lifted it carefully. The inside was stained with dried blood, the name tag scratched out completely. But the decal on the side made his stomach drop. It belonged to a reconnaissance squad that had been reported missing 5 months ago. Official cause: radio failure and presumed desertion. But this was not desertion. Jalen felt the men behind him stiffen as they gathered around the outpost ruins. "Command lied to us," Hughes murmured, voice trembling. "We're not the first here." Jalen scanned the perimeter. The more he looked, the more clues he found. Shredded tactical gloves, empty ammunition boxes, and damaged gear shoved beneath clusters of rocks, as if someone had tried to hide it. But there were no bodies, not even bones. "Where are the soldiers?" Cross whispered. Jalen's mind raced. "No vultures haber do overhead." No animal tracks marked the soil. Whatever wiped out the previous unit hadn't just killed them, it had removed them entirely. Erased them in the same way the briefing had erased their mission. He felt a cold heaviness settle into his chest. Something was operating in this valley. Something that understood how to hunt, how to eliminate, and how to cover its tracks with terrifying precision. Further ahead, Private Mendez called out softly. "Sir, you need to see this." Jalen moved to where the young soldier stood frozen at the base of a boulder. Etched into the rock was a symbol, 3 jagged lines intersecting a circle. The grooves were deep, carved with force, and smeared with old, darkened blood. Jalen ran a finger along the markings. They weren't random. They were deliberate. A warning, or a claim. The men stared at the symbol in uneasy silence until a gust of cold wind swept through the valley, rippling across their uniforms. It carried no scent, nothing but a hollow emptiness, as if stripped clean by something unnatural. Jalen stood slowly, his expression hardening. This wasn't a battlefield. This was preparation for something brutal, planned, and already in motion. And Falcon Echo had just stepped into the same shadow that swallowed the unit before them. The first attack did not come with warning shots, shouts, or the telltale echo of enemy movement. It came with silence, an unnatural, suffocating stillness that pressed against Falcon Echo like the tightening of a fist. Jalen felt it before he heard anything, a prickling along the back of his neck that made him raise a fist and halt the unit. Every man froze. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Hughes scanned the ridges. "Sir, I don't see anything." But that was the problem. Jalen's instincts screamed that something was wrong. Something was watching them, waiting. He opened his mouth to order a fallback position when a flash of movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Too fast, too controlled to be a stray animal. A fraction of a second later, a single shot cracked through the valley. Hughes jerked back, collapsing into the dirt, before any of them could process what happened. The men dove for cover automatically, training taking over, but Jalen knew instantly this was no ordinary ambush. Bullets rained down from the ridges with impossible precision. Not a spray, not frantic firing, surgical, coordinated shots meant to cut them apart piece by piece. Jalen rolled behind a crumbling barrier, grabbing Hughes by the vest and dragging him to safety. But one look at the lifeless eyes staring back at him told the truth. Hughes had been dead the moment the bullet hit. Cross returned fire toward the ridge, but his rounds sparked off rock, revealing nothing. "I don't have eyes on them," he shouted. "Where the hell are they?" Another explosion ripped through the valley, sending a shockwave of dirt and debris into the air. Falcon Echo scrambled to reposition, but every movement was met instantly with incoming fire. Whoever these attackers were, they weren't amateurs. They weren't insurgents. They were coordinated like elite soldiers, striking in synchronized bursts, pushing Falcon Echo into a kill zone without ever exposing themselves. Jalen shouted commands, trying to establish a defensive perimeter. "Left flank, move. Get behind cover." But as the men shifted, another explosion detonated behind them, cutting off their retreat. The valley wasn't just a battleground. It was a trap with preset charges, designed to funnel them exactly where the enemy wanted. In seconds, 2 more soldiers fell, one from a headshot, another thrown by the concussive blast of a hidden mine. The remaining men panicked, shouting over one another, firing into shadows. Jalen forced himself calm, scanning for patterns. And then he saw it. The attackers weren't firing randomly. They were targeting leaders first, communications specialists next. They were dismantling the unit structure with chilling efficiency. A shadow flickered along the ridge. Finally, A glimpse. A figure in dark tactical gear, face masked, weapon steady. Not insurgent attire. Military grade. Jalen's stomach twisted. "These aren't rebels," he muttered. "They're trained. They're organized." It hit him like a blow to the chest. Falcon Echo wasn't ambushed by chance. They were being erased. Systematically. The attackers advanced from the ridges with terrifying precision, their movements silent and ghost-like. More explosions followed, bright flashes that lit the valley in brief stutters of chaos. Jalen saw men he had trained, laughed with, bled with, falling one after another, swallowed by smoke and dust. The massacre had begun, and Jalen understood the truth with sudden, brutal clarity. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution, and Falcon Echo had walked straight into it. Jalen's world collapsed into smoke, fire, and screams. Falcon Echo, 12 men he knew better than family, were being torn apart in minutes. No time to mourn. No time to think. Only survival. He grabbed Corporal Mendez by the vest and hauled him behind a shattered boulder. But before they could reposition, a burst of gunfire stitched across the stone like a burning saw blade. Mendez jerked forward with a choked gasp, blood spraying across Jalen's sleeve. Jalen pressed a hand to the wound, but there was nothing to save. Mendez's eyes dimmed while Jalen's fingers were still gripping him. Another life gone. Another brother erased. Jalen pulled his hand back, heart shattering. He didn't even get to say goodbye. Bullets screamed overhead, bouncing violently off the surrounding rock. Dust and debris filled the air, making it hard to breathe, harder to see. Jalen ducked lower, scanning desperately for survivors. What he found instead was devastation. Bodies slumped against rocks, gear scattered across the ground like the remnants of a crushed tribe, smoke rising from detonated charges that had been buried beneath the soil long before Falcon Echo stepped foot here. "Ward, move!" Lieutenant Cross's voice cut through the chaos. Jalen looked left to see Cross waving him toward a line of jagged rocks that could give them temporary cover. Jalen sprinted, feeling heat from nearby explosions lick at his legs as shrapnel tore into the ground around him. The valley thundered with another coordinated blast, forcing both men into the dirt. Cross grabbed Jalen's arm and pulled him behind the rocks, chest heaving. "We're pinned," Cross shouted, but the words were lost under another burst of sniper fire that hit so close Jalen felt the vibration through the stone. Jalen peered over the ridge for a split second, just enough time to see dark, masked figures advancing in a perfectly timed formation. They moved like shadows, silent and synchronized. These were not local fighters. These were professionals. "Sir, they're hurting us," Jalen whispered. Cross's expression changed from panic to realization. The men weren't being overwhelmed by chaos. They were being guided into slaughter. "We need to regroup," Cross yelled, but even he knew it was pointless. There was no unit left to regroup. A rocket-propelled blast hit the rock formation next to them, sending Cross flying backward. Jalen dove to shield him from the falling debris, but when he turned Cross over, the lieutenant's chest was still. A shard of metal protruded from where his heart should have been beating. Jalen felt his breath leave him in a hollow exhale. His lieutenant, his friend, gone. His ears rang, drowning out the gunfire, drowning out the smoke-filled screams, drowning out everything except the crushing weight of loss. He was alone now, truly alone. The enemy closed in, sweeping the valley like a tide of ghosts. Jalen staggered backward, adrenaline overtaking grief. There was no winning this fight, no saving anyone else. The only thing left was survival, and even that seemed like a fantasy. He sprinted toward the canyon slope, zigzagging to avoid sniper fire. A bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him sideways, but he forced himself up and kept running. Blood soaked his sleeve, pain burning like fire, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Behind him, the valley echoed with the final gunshots marking the end of Falcon Echo. Every man he loved was dead, and Jalen Ward, bleeding, broken, hunted, became the sole survivor of a massacre designed to leave no survivors at all. Jalen didn't remember how long he ran, only the feeling of his boots striking uneven ground and the sharp, burning pulse in his shoulder with every step. The world blurred into streaks of rock and dust as he stumbled toward the canyon wall. Each breath tore at his lungs, tasting of smoke and blood. His ears still rang with the ghostly echo of gunfire, the screams of his men playing in a loop he couldn't shut off. When he finally collapsed behind a cluster of jagged stones, the silence hit him harder than the bullets. It was the silence of absence. The silence of knowing he was the last heartbeat from Falcon Echo still pounding in that cursed valley. He pressed a trembling hand against his wound, feeling warm blood seep between his fingers. His vision wavered, spots forming at the edges. He forced himself to breathe slow, controlled, the way he'd been taught. Panic was death, and he had already escaped death once today. For a long moment, Jalen crouched there, chest heaving, mind spinning between the present and the past. Why them? Why all of them? Why me? The questions hammered inside him, but answers felt impossible. Falcon Echo wasn't supposed to die this way. They were elite, trained, disciplined. These weren't men who broke easily. They didn't fall in panic or confusion. Yet the massacre unfolded with such precision that even their training couldn't save them. Jalen pressed his head against the cool stone behind him, eyes closed. His mind drifted unwillingly to the faces of his brothers. Hughes grinning during card games, Mendez humming off-key at dawn, Cross giving pep talks before missions. Gone. All gone. The grief hit him suddenly, violently, like his lung had been squeezed. But grief was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. Not here. A soft crunch of gravel snapped him back. His eyes shot open as he pressed his body tighter against the stone. He held his breath and listened. Footsteps, multiple, moving with the eerie coordination he had witnessed during the attack. The enemy was hunting survivors, sweeping the valley in structured patterns. Jalen slowly eased his rifle upward, but his hands shook. He was too weak to fight head-on, too exposed to run. If they found him now, it was over. He pressed his forehead against the ground and forced himself into stillness. As the footsteps grew louder, a memory surfaced. Something carved deep into him long before he ever wore a uniform. He saw himself at 10 years old, crouched behind a dumpster in his old neighborhood as gunfire erupted between rival crews. His mother had dragged him down, pressing a hand over his mouth to keep him quiet while bullets whistled through the air. "Listen," she whispered, heart pounding against his cheek. "Survival is knowing when not to move, when not to breathe. When the world is hunting you, silence becomes strength." She taught him to sense danger before it appeared, to read the patterns of violence, to move only when the moment demanded it. And in that valley, bleeding and alone, those childhood instincts flickered back to life like dying embers reigniting. The footsteps passed, slow, synchronized. Jalen remained motionless until they faded into the distance. His breath shuddered out of him, relief and terror blending into something sharp and overwhelming. He wasn't safe, but he wasn't dead either. Not yet. He wiped the blood from his chin, forced himself upright, and whispered to the empty valley, "Not today. Not like this." Then, leaning on the rock for support, he pushed deeper into the canyon's shadows, because surviving wasn't enough. He needed to understand why Falcon Echo died, and why he hadn't. Night began to settle over the valley, dragging long shadows across the canyon walls as Jalen forced himself deeper into the rock formations. His wound throbbed in unbearable waves, threatening to pull him into unconsciousness with every step. He needed shelter, anywhere he could hide, treat the bleeding, and regain even a fraction of strength. The canyon narrowed into a jagged passage where the ground dipped into a series of small caverns carved by decades of erosion. Jalen scanned them carefully before choosing the deepest one, its entrance partially blocked by a fallen slab of stone. He squeezed inside, dragging his pack across the dirt, and collapsed against the cool wall with a guttural exhale. The cave swallowed the last traces of daylight, offering him darkness. Dangerous, suffocating, but safer than open terrain. Outside, faint voices echoed across the valley. The enemy was still sweeping the perimeter, still hunting for any survivor who might expose what had happened. Jalen's pulse quickened. These weren't the chaotic shouts of insurgents or panicked rebels. Their movements were organized, precise. He could hear the click of boots hitting stone in coordinated tempo, like a squad drilled to perfection. Every few minutes, a sharp whistle cut through the air. A signal. Jalen leaned against the cave wall, forcing slow breaths. He recognized the pattern. The enemy was clearing sections quadrant by quadrant, ensuring every inch of the valley was scanned for life. Anyone caught wandering would be executed on the spot, and no bodies would be left behind. He tore a strip from his sleeve and pressed it against the wound in his shoulder, gritting his teeth until his jaw ached. As the pain burned through him, his thoughts drifted to something he had tried not to face since the massacre began. The possibility that this wasn't just an enemy ambush. It was too clean, too efficient, too planned. Falcon Echo had walked into a machine built for erasure, and someone, somewhere, had turned it on knowing exactly what would happen. The thought made his stomach twist. Was he meant to be dead right now? Was his survival just a mistake in someone's operation? A sudden crunch outside the cave jolted him still. Footsteps. Close. Too close. Jalen pressed flat against the wall, holding his breath as a shadow passed across the cave entrance. He could see the silhouette clearly, a figure with tactical gear and a suppressed rifle. The man paused, sweeping his weapon slowly across the ground. Jalen felt sweat bead along his forehead. If the soldier stepped 2 feet inside, the cave's acoustics would betray him. Breathing, heartbeat, anything. The figure shifted, kneeling. Dirt crumbled beneath his boots. Jalen's fingers tightened around his knife. Not because he wanted to fight, but because this cave was his only chance. He wouldn't die crawling out into open fire. Then a radio crackled softly on the soldier's vest. A static-filled voice murmured something in a language Jalen didn't recognize. Clipped, mechanical, coded. The soldier stood, turned, and followed the signal away from the cave, footsteps fading like a phantom dissolving into the night. Jalen let out a slow, trembling breath, nearly collapsing with relief and exhaustion. As the valley darkened completely and the temperature dipped into a biting chill, Jalen realized he hadn't just escaped death. He had witnessed confirmation. The enemy wasn't searching for survivors out of routine. They were making sure the massacre remained total, absolute, unquestioned. And the fact that he was still alive meant one thing. Someone's perfect plan had cracked. And Jalen Ward was the loose end they hadn't accounted for. Jalen didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the massacre. Hughes falling backward with blood in his eyes, Mendez gasping for air, Cross lying lifeless under shattered rock. The images struck like hammer blows, jolting him awake each time exhaustion dragged him under. By dawn, the cave felt smaller, the air colder, his wound hotter. He needed to move. Staying still meant death. He knew the enemy would sweep the area again at sunrise. He secured his gear as quietly as possible, gritting his teeth as pain sliced through his shoulder, and pushed himself toward the cave entrance. Outside, the early light cast an eerie glow over the valley floor, illuminating debris from last night's slaughter. Jalen crouched low, scanning for movement. The patrols had shifted. Their presence wasn't gone. It had simply spread wider, forming a loose net around the canyon edges. They weren't searching for survivors anymore. They were locking down the valley. Jalen moved with slow precision, keeping to the shadows between the rocks as he made his way east, deeper into the valley's heart. He needed answers, and if the military hadn't given them, the land might. The deeper he pushed, the more he realized the terrain felt intentionally altered. Trees were snapped clean at the base, not from explosions but by unnatural force. Boulders had been rolled or dragged into strange formations that served no purpose except to funnel movement. It was a battlefield shaped by someone who understood how to manipulate terrain and force enemy units into predictable pathways. Falcon Echo hadn't been unlucky. They had been guided, herded into death. Jalen paused near a cluster of large stones, crouching behind one as he spotted something ahead. An abandoned fire pit, still smoldering faintly. The ashes were black, charred, and fresh. Someone had been here within the last 12 hours. He approached slowly, checking the perimeter, and found footprints of different sizes, different depths. A group, not military boots, more like makeshift footwear, locals perhaps, civilians, or survivors from another unit. But if people were living out here, hiding in this valley, then something much bigger was happening than an insurgent ambush. A rustling sound snapped his attention to the treeline. Jalen dropped into a crouch, rifle raised. Two shadows darted between the trees, moving with surprising discipline. They weren't hunters. They weren't panicked civilians. They were recon observing him, testing him. Jalen's pulse hammered in his ears as he tracked their position. Then one of them stepped out from behind a fallen log. A young girl, no older than 16, with dirt smeared across her face and a crude sling strapped to her back. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, assessing him with a precision that didn't match her age. Before he could speak, she raised a finger to her lips in a gesture of warning. Jalen stiffened. Behind her, a second figure appeared. A small boy, maybe 12, carrying a battered pair of binoculars. The girl pointed to the mountainside behind Jalen. He turned just enough to see the movement. A pair of enemy scouts scanning the area with infrared devices. If Jalen had stepped forward 30 seconds earlier, he would have been spotted. The girl motioned for him to follow. Trust her? Trust a stranger in a valley full of death? But the enemy was closing in. And these two clearly knew how to survive here. Jalen hesitated only a moment before slipping into the trees behind them. As they moved deeper into the forest, the girl didn't look back, but she spoke softly. "They saw you. They're coming." Jalen's heart pounded as he followed the children into the hidden trails. For the first time since the massacre, he wasn't running blindly. He was following people who knew the truth of this valley, and maybe why no one ever made it out alive. Jalen followed the two children through the dense underbrush, his breath shallow and controlled as they navigated narrow deer trails hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves. The deeper they went, the thicker the vegetation became, turning the valley into a labyrinth of roots, thorns, and steep embankments. Despite their age, the children moved with a fluid, almost instinctive precision, ducking under branches, stepping only on hardened patches of earth, avoiding areas where the ground looked deceptively soft. They'd learned these paths the hard way. Jalen could see it in the way the girl, clearly the leader, never wasted emotion. She glanced back only when necessary, checking that he kept close but never slowing down for him. Her posture radiated a type of discipline he recognized, survival earned, not taught. The boy, smaller and quieter, stopped occasionally to listen for distant movement. Once, he pressed his ear to the ground, shook his head, and motioned them forward faster. Jalen followed, his heart pounding harder with every passing second. They weren't just moving, they were evading. Something was behind them, something closing in. The forest grew unnervingly quiet again. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of their footsteps crunching softly across the dirt. Finally, the girl slowed and guided them into a narrow ravine hidden between two boulders. The space was tight, forcing them to crouch, but it offered cover from above. She motioned for silence. Jalen obeyed. Seconds later, he heard it, the low, rhythmic crunch of boots marching in formation. Two enemy patrolmen passed along a ridge not 10 feet above them, scanning the area with rifles fitted with thermal scopes. Jalen tensed, gripping his weapon, the instinct to fight screaming in his veins. But the girl gently touched his wrist, urging patience. The two enemies paused, scanning the forest. One muttered something in that same clipped, coded language Jalen had heard near the cave. Then, after a long silence, they moved on, their ghost-like efficiency sending a shiver up Jalen's spine. When the footsteps finally faded, the girl let out a controlled breath and motioned for him to continue following. They pushed deeper until the ravine opened into a small clearing surrounded by high stone walls. It was a hidden pocket of the valley, secluded, sheltered, and impossible to spot from above. There, concealed with branches and camouflage tarps, sat a makeshift encampment. 3 older survivors, 2 men and 1 woman, stood immediately, grabbing makeshift weapons as Jalen entered. Their faces were drawn, starved, and exhausted, yet fiercely alert. For a moment, tension crackled through the air, the adults leveling their weapons at him. The girl stepped between them and Jalen, raising a hand. "He's not one of them," she whispered. "He's a soldier." Jalen lifted his hands to show he wasn't a threat. Sweat dripped down his temple, and pain radiated from his wounded shoulder. The adults exchanged wary looks. Finally, the eldest man, a tall, gaunt figure with a thick beard, lowered his spear. "Another one," he said quietly. "Another soldier sent to die here." Jalen's gaze swept the camp. Supplies were scarce. Everyone was thin, worn down by fear, hunger, and the constant threat outside. "How long have you all been here?" he asked. The woman's eyes filled with a haunted resignation. "Months." Jalen's chest tightened. Months. People had been trapped in this valley for months, without extraction, without help, without even acknowledgement from the outside world. The girl's voice broke the silence. "You saw what they did to your unit, didn't you?" Jalen swallowed hard, his voice rough. "Yes." The girl nodded slowly, her young face hardened by trauma far beyond her years. "Then you already know," she whispered. "No one is meant to leave this place alive." Jalen sat against the stone wall of the hidden encampment, his pulse still racing as the survivors watched him with a mix of suspicion and desperate hope. The girl, the one who had led him here, sat beside the boy near a small fire pit made from scavenged metal. No flames burned. Smoke would give them away. Instead, faint embers glowed under a layer of soil, giving off just enough warmth to keep the night cold from killing them. The older man who had first spoken stepped forward, his movements stiff with fatigue. He lowered himself onto a crate and studied Jalen with tired, sunken eyes. "What's your name, soldier?" he asked. "Sergeant Jalen Ward," Jalen replied. The man nodded slowly. "Ward." His tone carried recognition, not of Jalen himself, but of what Falcon Echo represented. "So they sent another elite unit," he murmured. "Another group of men they knew wouldn't come back." Jalen felt his stomach tighten. "What do you mean another?" The woman exchanged a grim look with the bearded man before standing up and retrieving something from the back of the camp. A battered metal case with a broken military insignia on it. She placed it gently at Jalen's feet. "Open it," she said. Jalen flipped the latches and lifted the lid. Inside were identification tags, dozens of them. American, British, and others. Some were scratched. Some were bent. Some still had dried blood embedded in the grooves. Jalen picked one up and froze. It belonged to a unit he recognized. An elite recon team reported missing 18 months ago, supposedly due to unpredictable weather conditions. But the tags were not the only evidence. Below them lay documents, crumpled, torn, water-stained, but unmistakably official. Jalen spread them out across the dirt. Satellite photos, redacted reports, mission orders stamped with classified and terminated. And in every document, one pattern repeated: commands that sent elite teams into the valley, followed by abrupt cancellations of the missions. No extraction orders. No recovery teams. The bearded man leaned closer. "They knew, Ward. Your superiors knew exactly what was in this valley." His voice trembled with restrained anger. "These teams were never meant to survive. They were sent here to bury a mistake the government made years ago." Jalen felt a chill crawl up his spine. "What kind of mistake?" The woman knelt beside one of the extracted documents and tapped a faded image. Jalen squinted, trying to decipher it. The photo showed a bunker, half hidden by rock and foliage, marked with codes tied to covert research programs. "A testing site," she explained. "Biological, psychological, experimental units built during the earlier conflicts. When the trials went wrong, they tried to seal it all off. But something survived down here. Something that didn't stay contained. Jalen's blood ran cold. The attackers? Those masked soldiers? The man shook his head. Not soldiers. Not anymore. He pointed to a section of a torn file depicting silhouettes of operatives undergoing behavioral augmentation tests. They were human once, an experimental battalion designed to follow orders without hesitation. But something corrupted the program. Something broke their minds. When the military lost control, they abandoned the valley and erased all record of it. The girl spoke softly from her corner. And when people came here by accident, or when patrols went missing, they sent more soldiers to silence the problem. Jalen stared at the documents, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Falcon Echo hadn't been deployed to investigate insurgents. They had been deployed to die, to keep whatever horror lived here buried forever. Jalen clenched his jaw, rage simmering beneath the grief. They massacred my brothers to hide their own sins, he whispered. The older man nodded, his eyes heavy with sorrow. And now, Sergeant, you're the only one left who can expose the truth. Jalen stared at the scattered documents until the lines blurred into a haze. His breath came slow and uneven, rage simmering beneath every inhale. Falcon Echo hadn't been outmaneuvered. They hadn't been ambushed. They hadn't walked into a random firefight. They had been sacrificed. Disposable pieces in a long trail of cover-ups. The realization settled into his bones with crushing weight. Every man he trained beside, every brother who trusted their mission, every life that ended screaming in that valley. They were all victims of a system that had decided their deaths were more convenient than their survival. Jalen pressed his palms against the dirt, knuckles trembling. They lied to us, he muttered. They sent us here knowing we'd be wiped out. The woman nodded solemnly. They've done it before. They'll do it again. The bearded man added, Your unit. You weren't the first, but you might be the last. They've deployed enough teams to know exactly what happens here. The boy sat beside him quietly, staring at the dog tags with wide, haunted eyes. Sometimes we hear them, he whispered. At night, the men who died. Jalen's chest tightened. What do you mean? The girl gave him a look that was both hard and heartbreaking. Their radios, their distress calls, their last moments repeating on loop. She tapped the side of her head. Memories stick to this place. Or maybe someone keeps replaying them. Jalen felt a shiver crawl down his spine. Voices trapped in static. Echoes of death. This valley wasn't silent. It was screaming beneath the surface. Jalen forced himself back to the documents. One page in particular caught his attention. A mission directive stamped with the insignia of a covert research division he had only heard rumors about. The tasking language was vague, but one phrase stood out. Termination of remaining subjects recommended. Any survivors deemed compromised. Jalen read those words again, blood boiling. They didn't fail to recover the previous units, he said slowly. They didn't try. The bearded man's jaw clenched. Exactly. Jalen gathered the files, smoothing them as best he could. But how did you survive? The woman gestured toward the stone walls. We hid. We kept moving. We scavenged from those who didn't make it. And eventually, the valley stopped noticing us. The girl added, we stay quiet, stay small, stay smart. Jalen nodded, admiration flickering despite everything. These people weren't soldiers. They weren't trained for war. Yet they'd survived in a place designed to erase entire units. But Jalen wasn't built to hide. He couldn't picture himself waiting out the days in a hole while the truth of Falcon Echo's murder rotted under classified files. There has to be a way out, he said, more to himself than to the group. The bearded man sighed. There is. But it's not a way anyone survives. He pointed to a red-marked zone on a recovered map. That's where the original bunker is, the heart of all this. Whatever created those, he said, gesturing toward the valley, began there, and that's where the strongest patrols are. The woman added, no one who's gone there has come back. Jalen folded the map, fire burning behind his eyes. Someone needs to. The survivors exchanged fearful glances, as if they were watching a man willingly walk into the jaws of a monster. But Jalen knew the truth. He wasn't walking toward death. He was walking toward answers, toward justice, toward the only path that could give meaning to the sacrifice of his men. He stood slowly, gripping the strapped-up wound on his shoulder. "If the valley wants me dead," he said, voice steady and cold, "it'll have to try harder," because Sergeant Jalen Ward wasn't done fighting. Not for himself, but for the unit the world had tried to erase. Jalen sat in the dim shelter of the stone-walled camp long after the others had drifted into uneasy rest, unable to quiet the storm raging inside him. The valley pressed in from all sides, an invisible weight, a suffocating presence that seemed to breathe with the night. Every few minutes, distant echoes flickered across the silence. A faint metallic click, the crunch of a boot against gravel, the subtle shift of leaves stirred by something that wasn't wind. Enemy patrols. They never slept. Jalen stared down at the pile of dog tags in front of him, running his thumb across the engraved names. Each tag was a life reduced to metal and memory. Brothers, fathers, sons, men who had carried hope, fear, jokes, dreams. Now nothing but evidence of crimes buried beneath classified ink. Jalen clenched his jaw until it ached. He refused to let Falcon Echo become another pile in this camp. He reached for his notebook, one he always kept tucked inside his vest, and began writing. Not mission logs, not coordinates, not orders, names. Every name he could remember, every detail about each fallen soldier. Their quirks, their habits, their stories. He wrote until his hand cramped, until tears blurred the ink. Hughes, who hummed whenever he was nervous. Mendez, who carried pictures of his newborn daughter in his helmet. Cross, who wrote letters to his wife he never had time to send. Jalen filled page after page with their humanity, the humanity the military would have scrubbed clean. The more he wrote, the heavier his chest became, and the stronger his resolve grew. Falcon Echo would not disappear into silence. Not while he breathed. At some point, the girl approached silently, holding a dented canteen. "You need water," she said softly. Jalen took it and nodded his thanks. She hesitated before sitting beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. "Did you lose people before this?" she asked. Jalen swallowed hard. "Yeah," he whispered. "But not like this." The girl studied him. "You write their names so you don't forget?" Jalen shook his head. "I write their names so the world won't." Her eyes softened. "My father used to say that remembering is a kind of rebellion." Jalen allowed himself the faintest smile. "Your father was right." The night grew colder. Jalen's wound throbbed with a slow, venomous burn, and his body trembled with exhaustion. Hallucinations crept at the edges of his mind. Flickers of movement, whispers of familiar voices, shadows shaped like fallen teammates. He squeezed his eyes shut and focused on breathing. Unsteady, out-controlled. Survival depended on clarity, and clarity depended on not letting grief consume him. He shifted his focus back to the map he had taken from the survivors, tracing the red-marked zone where the bunker lay hidden. His pulse quickened. That was where the truth lived. That was where Falcon Echo's killers came from. That was where the valley's secret rotted. He folded the map carefully and tucked it into his vest. He wasn't ready, not physically, not mentally, but he knew the moment was coming. He couldn't stay in this pocket of safety forever. Safety was a cage, and Jalen Ward wasn't built to hide behind others. He was built to stand, to fight, to drag the truth out of the shadows even if it killed him. As dawn began to creep into the sky, Jalen whispered to the ghosts in his memory, "I'll finish what you started. All of you, I promise." And for the first time since the massacre, he felt purpose stronger than pain. Morning light filtered weakly through the canopy overhead, turning the valley into a maze of pale gold and long shadows. Jalen rose from his makeshift bedding long before the others stirred, his muscles stiff, his shoulder throbbing like a warning pulse beneath the bandage. But none of that mattered. Not compared to the map burned into his mind, the red-marked zone where answers waited. He stepped out into the clearing, scanning the terrain with the instinct of a man who no longer expected safety anywhere. The bearded survivor approached quietly, eyes heavy but resolute. "If you're planning to head toward that bunker," he said, "you need to know something first." Jalen raised an eyebrow. The man continued, "The patrols aren't random. They move like blood through veins. Every path in this valley leads back to that place one way or another. They protect it like a heart." Jalen nodded slowly. "Then I need to get there before they know I'm coming." The man shook his head. "They always know, but you might buy time if you move when they shift positions." He pointed toward the ridge beyond the camp, where faint trails zigzagged through dense brush. "They rotate patrol routes on a strict cycle. We've learned the pattern." Jalen followed his finger, studying the terrain. Before he could ask questions, the girl appeared at his side. "They'll sweep the eastern ridge in 20 minutes, she said. "If you leave now and move fast, you can cross before they circle back." Her voice was steady despite the fear in her eyes. She wasn't guessing. She had survived by learning the valley's rhythms better than any soldier. Jalen crouched beside the map on the dirt, flipping it open to review the hand-marked patrol routes. Lines crisscrossed the valley like a spider's web, some thick and bold, others faint, indicating shifting routes. But one section stood out, a cluster of dark arrows pointing toward a narrow canyon that cut through the valley's center. The bunker entrance. The girl knelt beside him and tapped that canyon. "They doubled patrols here after your unit arrived. They were preparing for you." The words hit Jalen like a blow. "Preparing for us?" She nodded. "They've been expecting another team for months. They always know when new soldiers are sent. They study how you move, how you fight, and they kill faster each time." Jalen clenched his jaw, anger tightening his chest. Falcon Echo had walked into a massacre orchestrated with chilling foresight. He reached for his rifle, checking the magazine, then secured his pack. He could feel the weight of 100 choices pressing on him. Stay with these survivors and hide forever, or walk into the lion's den alone. But he already knew the answer. Hiding would mean accepting that Falcon Echo died for nothing. Exposing the truth meant walking straight into the valley's darkest throat. "I'm going," he said. "Now." The bearded man gripped his arm. "Ward, they'll kill you before you get close." Jalen met his gaze, eyes hard. "They already tried." The girl hesitated, then pulled something from her pocket. A small, tattered map fragment showing a secret path that tunneled beneath a rocky ridge. "Take this," she said. "It might get you close without being seen." Jalen took it, surprised by the detail. "Where did you get this?" She looked down. "From someone who didn't make it." Her voice cracked slightly, then steadied. "Make it mean something." Jalen tucked the fragment into his vest. The camp watched him in heavy silence as he stepped beyond their hidden sanctuary. He paused once, glancing back at the frightened but defiant faces of those who had survived by clinging to the shadows. Then he turned toward the ridge. He wasn't just walking toward the bunker. He was walking toward the truth, and the truth was waiting for him like a loaded weapon. Jalen moved swiftly along the narrow ridge path, grateful for the cloud cover that kept the sun weak and the shadows deep. Every step was deliberate, measured. Too much weight on a loose rock could send him tumbling down the slope and alert the patrols below. The valley stretched beneath him like a scar carved into the earth, its quiet stillness masking the lethal presence coiled within it. As he climbed, the pain in his shoulder sharpened until it radiated down his arm in pulsing waves. He ignored it. Pain meant he was alive. Pain meant he still had something to fight for. When he reached the first overlook, he crouched behind a cluster of jagged stones and studied the terrain below. There, cutting through the valley like a throat, was the canyon that led to the bunker. Even from this distance, Jalen could see movement, dark, fluid shapes slipping between boulders and broken earth. Patrols, at least a dozen of them, and those were only the visible ones. He pulled out the torn map fragment the girl had given him and matched the markings to the land before him. The alternate route she'd shown wasn't easy. It slithered beneath an unstable rock formation on the canyon's north side, a place where landslides had carved tunnels and pockets into the earth. Perfect hiding spot, and a perfect grave if the ground collapsed. But Jalen knew immediately it was his best chance. The main paths were impossible, crawling with patrols, drones, and sentries who moved with military precision. They would spot him long before he got within range of the bunker's entrance. But the underpass, that offered a ghost's approach, if he timed it right. He scanned the mountain slopes again, watching the patrol rhythm. The survivors had been right. The enemy moved in cycles, shifting every 10 minutes like clockwork. They swept the valley with mathematical precision, watching every approach except the ones they believed impossible for a single man to traverse. Good, Jalen thought. Let them underestimate him. It was the last mistake they'd ever make. He waited until the patrol on the north edge turned its backs and began moving east. Then he moved. The descent was brutal. The slope was steep enough to force him into a controlled slide, boots scraping against loose gravel that threatened to cascade with each shift of his weight. Rocks rattled beneath him, some tumbling loudly into the canyon below. Jalen froze each time, breath held, scanning for any sign that the sound had drawn attention. But no movement came. When he finally reached the base of the canyon wall, sweat soaked his shirt despite the cold air. He ducked behind an outcropping, chest heaving. Ahead, partially hidden behind a curtain of vines and shattered stone, was the entrance to the secret path, the narrow crawlspace marked on the girl's map. It looked barely wide enough for him to fit through. Dark, tight, crumbling. One wrong move and the entire structure could collapse on top of him. Jalen slid his fingers along the edge of the opening, feeling the cool grit and loose sand. He should have hesitated. Any rational man would have hesitated. Instead, he pressed his body into the gap and began to crawl. The tunnel squeezed the breath from his lungs as he dragged himself forward inch by inch. Pebbles scraped his elbows. Dust choked him with every breath. A sudden rumble overhead sent a shower of grit into his hair, and the ceiling sagged dangerously before settling again. Jalen clenched his teeth, refusing to back out. He kept crawling until the tunnel abruptly widened, opening into a cavern hidden beneath the canyon floor. Here, low shafts of natural light filtered through cracks above, illuminating something chilling on the stone walls. Markings. Dozens of them. Jagged circles intersected by 3 lines, the same symbol he had seen earlier carved into the valley rock. His stomach tightened. He reached out and touched the nearest symbol. The grooves were fresh, clean, as if carved recently. Someone or something had marked this place, and whatever it was closer than he'd ever been. Jalen's pulse quickened as he stepped deeper into the cavern, its stone walls echoing the soft crunch of his boots. The air felt charged, thick, metallic, almost humming with a presence he couldn't see. Pockets of light filtered through cracks above, creating thin, shifting beams that illuminated the dust swirling around him like drifting ash. The deeper he moved, the more symbols he found etched into the stone. Some carved violently, others carefully marked as if placed with ritual precision. The same circle intersected by 3 jagged lines. Again and again, dozens, maybe hundreds. With each one he passed, the hair on his arms stood taller. These weren't warnings. They weren't territorial markers. They were instructions, or a map left by something that had learned to navigate this valley long before Falcon Echo ever entered it. A faint sound broke the stillness, the distant, rhythmic tap of metal against rock. Not loud, not hurried, measured, deliberate. Jalen froze, every muscle tightening as instinct screamed at him to retreat. He slid behind a stone pillar, steadying his breathing and listening. The tapping continued, echoing through the cavern in slow, consistent beats. Someone was down here, or something that mimicked someone. Jalen waited, counting the rhythm in his head. It wasn't random. It followed a pattern: 3 taps, pause, 2 taps, longer pause. It repeated. A signal. A code. Jalen scanned the shadows, eyes narrowing until he caught a faint movement deep within the cavern. A figure hunched over a section of the wall, illuminated only by a pale shaft of light that caught the blade in its hand. The silhouette moved stiffly, almost mechanically, chipping away at the stone with long, controlled motions. Jalen's breath hitched. The figure wore tattered remnants of a military uniform. The pattern was unmistakable, even beneath the dirt, blood, and torn fabric. Combat gear, tactical vest, boots, but the shape was wrong. The posture unnaturally rigid, the arms too long, the head slightly tilted in a way no human held it. Jalen stepped forward, keeping silent but ready to fire. As he moved closer, the figure stopped tapping and turned its head. The noise that escaped it wasn't a gasp or a growl. It was a distorted echo, like the playback of a corrupted recording. Its face was partially concealed by matted hair and a broken helmet fused to its skull. One eye glowed faintly with an artificial reflection, while the other was dark and sunken. Jalen felt the bottom of his stomach drop. This was no insurgent, no civilian, no soldier. This was one of the experimental operatives mentioned in the documents, augmented, broken, abandoned. The creature's fingers, once human, had fused with the metal tool it used to carve symbols into the stone. Its arm twitched uncontrollably. The light reflected off fresh blood along its forearm, its own dripping steadily as it worked. The creature released a glitching sound, half human, half mechanical. It stepped toward Jalen with jerky movements, as though guided by a fragmented instinct. Jalen aimed his rifle, heart pounding. "Stop!" he whispered. The creature paused, head tilting again, listening. Then, in a voice warped by years of damage, it rasped two broken words Jalen couldn't expect. "Help us!" Jalen's grip faltered. The creature convulsed, a shudder tearing through its frame. Behind it, deeper in the cavern, more faint lights flickered. More figures stirred. Not one, not a few, dozens. They had been trapped here, forgotten test subjects, warped into living remnants of a failed experiment, marking the walls with desperate symbols no one was meant to see. And Jalen realized the truth with cold horror. Falcon Echo hadn't been hunted by a simple enemy force. They had been hunted by the ghosts of a government creation gone terribly, violently wrong. Jalen staggered back a step, the weight of what he was seeing crashing over him like a tidal wave. Those weren't insurgents. They weren't enemy soldiers. They were the remnants of a forgotten battalion. Men turned into experiments, then abandoned in the dark to rot, mutate, and survive however they could. His mind clawed to reject it, but the evidence stood breathing in front of him. The creature, once a soldier, took a trembling step toward him, its mangled voice glitching again as if fighting through layers of broken memory. "Help us!" The words fractured in the cavern like fragile glass, echoing with agony that didn't sound human anymore. Jalen tightened his grip on his rifle, torn between instinct and compassion. This thing had been a person, a brother in uniform, a man with a life, a family, a story. What was left of him flickered in and out like a dying flame. Before Jalen could speak, a sudden metallic clang echoed from the far end of the cavern, followed by low, guttural growls that sent goosebumps racing across his skin. The creature before him twitched violently, its head jerking toward the sound. Its single glowing eye dimmed as it backed away, retreating into the shadows with desperate, frantic movements. Whatever was coming frightened it, and that terrified Jalen. He pressed his back against a stone pillar, scanning the cavern as deeper shadows shifted along the far wall. A cluster of figures emerged slowly, each one moving with a predatory fluidity that the broken creature lacked. These were different, stronger, more intact, less human. Their bodies were wrapped in hardened tissue that resembled a hybrid of muscle and armor, their faces masked by growths of fused bone that hid whatever humanity remained beneath. Jalen held his breath as the group advanced into the partial light. 6 of them, their silhouettes unervingly tall. Too tall. Their chests expanded in synchronized rhythm, inhaling the cave air with slow, deliberate precision. These weren't the forgotten. These were the perfected. The early subjects had deteriorated, these had adapted, evolved. Their eyes glimmered faintly with an amber reflection that made Jalen's blood run cold. That same glow he'd seen in the attackers who massacred Falcon Echo. These were the elite prototypes, the original nightmare. One stepped forward, sniffing the air. Its head turned sharply toward Jalen's hiding place. Jalen froze, refusing to even blink. The creature emitted a low clicking sound, like stones tapping underwater. The others responded with short, rhythmic clicks, communicating, coordinating. Jalen's mind raced. If they found him, he wouldn't stand a chance in a firefight. His only hope was that the darkness concealed him. But then the ground trembled, subtly at first, then with growing intensity. Dust rained from above. A warning rumble rolled through the cavern like distant thunder. The figures turned toward the deeper tunnels, tensing. Something else was moving. Something larger. Jalen seized the moment. While the creatures were distracted, he slipped behind a column of rock and moved silently toward the far tunnel's exit. Every step felt like walking across thin glass. His shoulder throbbed violently, the injury protesting each movement, but he pushed on, teeth clenched. As he approached an incline leading upward, another tremor rippled through the cavern, and this time, a deafening roar erupted from the depths. A roar that shook the stone. A roar that didn't belong to anything human. The creatures bolted toward the sound, their bodies flowing in eerie unison like wolves responding to an alpha's call. Jalen didn't wait to see what commanded them. He sprinted up the incline, lungs burning, the roar still vibrating through the stone beneath his boots. Whatever lived deeper in that cavern was the reason this valley was sealed. And it was awake. Jalen scrambled up the rocky incline, his lungs burning and his wounded shoulder screaming with every movement. The roar reverberated through the cavern once more. Longer this time, deeper, more guttural. It wasn't just sound. It was pressure, vibrating through the stone and hammering into his ribs like a physical force. Jalen pressed himself against the cavern wall, waiting for the tremor to pass. His pulse thundered in his ears. Whatever creature commanded the evolved prototypes had awakened fully, and the valley itself seemed to react. Fine dust drifted down in steady streams, and the cracks above widened with groans of shifting stone. If this cave collapsed, he'd never make it out. If the creatures caught him, collapsing wouldn't matter. He pushed forward, forcing his feet to move even as adrenaline battled exhaustion inside him. The incline narrowed into a steep tunnel, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Jalen ducked under jagged protrusions, gripping the rough walls for balance. The air grew warmer, heavy with humidity and the faint metallic scent that had haunted the valley since the moment Falcon Echo entered it. As he neared the tunnel's end, faint daylight glimmered ahead, a promise of open ground. But before he could reach it, the distant clicks resurfaced. Quick.
Urgent.
Hunting. Jalen stopped cold. He recognized the cadence. Those weren't the broken creatures or the evolved prototypes. These clicks were sharper, colder. The same ones he had heard just before Falcon Echo was slaughtered. The valley's elite hunters had entered the cave system, coming toward him. He backed up silently into a shadowed alcove, flattening himself against the stone as the first silhouette appeared at the tunnel's far end. The hunter moved with terrifying efficiency. Back low, weapon raised, movements synchronized with the faint glow of a tactical visor. Not monstrous, not mutated, fully human, yet conditioned, altered, driven into something mechanical. Jalen held his breath. All it would take was a glance in the wrong direction. But the hunter swept past the alcove, leading two more behind him. They communicated in low, coded tones, their radios barely above a whisper. Breach detected movement in lower chamber. Target may be alive. Jalen recognized the voice. Calm, precise, like someone reading a weather report instead of hunting a survivor. The hunters continued down the tunnel, their footfalls vanishing into the deeper dark. As soon as they passed, Jalen slipped out, heart pounding, and moved rapidly toward the exit. Sunlight spilled into the tunnel entrance as he emerged into the open air, momentarily blinded by the brightness. The landscape before him looked harsher now. Steeper ridges, tangled vegetation, and a cliffside path leading toward the canyon where the bunker lay hidden. Jalen ducked behind a fallen log to regain his breath, glancing back toward the cave. For a brief second, he saw one of the hunters reappear at the entrance, scanning the horizon. Their visor glinted. Then the figure turned away, heading back inside. The valley wasn't just searching for him. It was coordinating from mutated remnants to elite killers, rooted in the same silent command. Jalen swallowed hard. He had escaped the cavern by inches, but the path ahead would be worse. Because now everything in the valley knew he was alive, and everything was coming for him. Jalen pressed himself flat against the fallen log, forcing slow breaths through clenched teeth as his vision adjusted to the harsh daylight. Every inch of him ached. His battered shoulder throbbed like a second heartbeat. His legs trembled from hours of running, crawling, fighting to stay alive. But the moment his eyes cleared, he pushed the pain aside. The world outside the cavern was no safer than the horrors inside it. The air felt wrong. Too still, too heavy, as though the valley had paused, listening. The hunters inside the cave weren't the only threat. Something else stirred across the canyon cliffs, shifting the branches with unnatural rhythm. Jalen scanned the terrain. The path toward the bunker was narrow, jagged, and exposed. A single wrong move would give away his position to anything watching from above. He edged deeper into the brush, crouching low as he crept along the steep hillside. The earth beneath him was unstable, loose gravel sliding under his boots with every step. He forced himself to move slow, distributing his weight carefully. Halfway across, he heard the faint rustle of movement from a ledge above him. Jalen dropped instantly. A second later, a sharp metallic ping snapped against the rock where his head had been. A sniper. He rolled behind a protruding boulder just as another shot cracked through the air, sending shards of stone spraying across his arm. His pulse spiked. The hunters had left the cave and taken positions along the cliffs. He scanned the ridge, tracking the glint of a scope between leaves. The sniper's movements were silent, fluid, just like the elite killers who had ambushed Falcon Echo. Jalen waited, counting the seconds between each breath. When the wind shifted slightly, leaves fluttered near the sniper's perch, giving him a window. Jalen darted from cover, sprinting along the slope as another shot tore past his hip. He dove behind a dense cluster of ferns, heart pounding so loudly, he worried the sound alone would give him away. From his hiding spot, he spotted a narrow crack in the cliffside, barely noticeable beneath overgrown vines. A shortcut, or a trap, but staying exposed meant death. Jalen crawled toward it, slipping inside just as another sniper round slammed into the rock behind him. The crack expanded into a natural chute, sloping downward at a steep angle. Jalen slid uncontrollably, gravel ripping at his uniform, his palms scraping raw as he tried to slow himself. The chute ended abruptly, dropping him 3 feet into a shallow basin of mud and twisted roots. He groaned, pushing himself upright, only to freeze as he realized where he was. A killing field. The basin was ringed by jagged stone formations that offered no cover. And high above him, perched along the rim, were silhouettes. 6, maybe 7. Hunters. Their visors glowed faintly, reflecting the muted light. They stood perfectly still, like statues carved into the rock, waiting for him. Jalen's breath hitched. They had been tracking him long before he left the cavern. The valley hadn't just predicted his movements. It had funneled him here. The hunters descended with silent precision, moving in a synchronized formation that boxed him in from every direction. Jalen backed against a wall of stone, raising his weapon even though he knew the odds were hopeless. His shoulder screamed in protest. Sweat dripped into his eyes. The hunters advanced slowly, as if savoring the inevitable kill. Then something unexpected happened. A deep tremor rumbled beneath the ground. The hunters paused, heads snapping toward the canyon with machine-like coordination. Another quake followed, stronger this time, sending loose stones tumbling down the cliff face. The ground beneath Jalen's feet shifted violently. The hunters turned in unison toward the bunker's direction, And for the first time, Jalen saw hesitation in their movements. Fear. Whatever lived inside that bunker, whatever had awakened in the cavern's depths, had now begun to move above ground. And the valley's deadliest predators were no longer hunting Jalen. They were retreating from something far worse. The ground shook again, this time with a force that knocked Jalen to one knee. Dust cascaded from the cliffs, and several hunters lost their footing, scrambling backward in sharp, animal-like movements. Their retreat wasn't strategic. It wasn't tactical. It was instinctive. They were afraid. Jalen had never seen fear in these creatures. Not during the ambush, not in the cavern, not when they hunted him like prey. Whatever was coming from the direction of the bunker didn't just threaten him. Terrified them. Jalen pressed a trembling hand against the earth, feeling the tremors pulse upward like the heartbeat of something massive awakening beneath the valley floor. The air changed too, growing hotter, heavier, thick with some kind of vibrating energy that made the hair on his arms stand up. The hunters exchanged sharp, glitching clicks. Then, without warning, they scattered, darting up the walls of the basin, disappearing into the trees with a speed that no human could match. The silence they left behind was suffocating. Jalen forced himself upright, heart pounding, sweat mixing with blood on his torn uniform. He had no idea what he was facing now. But he knew this. If the hunters were retreating, he needed to move before whatever drove them off arrived. He sprinted toward a narrow exit at the far end of the basin, ducking under low branches and stumbling over twisted roots. The earth continued to tremble beneath him. Each quake grew stronger, sharper, like footsteps of something enormous approaching. As he climbed a steep ridge, a violent tremor cracked the ground behind him. The basin he had just escaped collapsed inward with a deafening roar, sending chunks of stone sliding into the hole that opened like a mouth swallowing the earth. Jalen reached the top of the ridge and collapsed behind a fallen tree, gasping for air. The sky began to dim unnaturally, the clouds swirling above him in tight, spiraling formations. The valley's energy shifted, becoming charged, electric. Jalen forced himself to stand and look down at the landscape in front of him. What he saw made his chest tighten. The bunker wasn't hidden anymore. Half the canyon wall had crumbled away, revealing a jagged opening into the underground complex. Plumes of dust and debris billowed upward. Inside the exposed chamber, something moved. Something massive. Shadows flickered against the broken walls, distorted by the dust. Then the roar came again, louder than before. A sound that wasn't human, wasn't animal. A sound built from agony, fury, and something mechanical woven into its core. The echoes rippled through the valley, sending birds flocking from trees miles away. Jalen's breath caught in his throat. "What the hell did they build down there?" he whispered. His radio, long dead, crackled weakly at his hip. A broken voice flickered through, distorted, fading, barely recognizable.
"Len?"
"Ward, if alive, run." Then silence. Whoever sent it was gone. But the message was clear enough. Jalen gripped his rifle, swallowed the knot in his throat, and began descending toward the exposed bunker. He didn't run away, he couldn't. If he fled now, the truth would be buried forever. The world would accept the lie, and Falcon Echo would remain a footnote erased from history. No, he had come too far. The tremors intensified as he moved closer. Stone cracked, metal screamed. Something inside the bunker dragged its colossal body across the debris, inching closer to the breach. Jalen ducked behind a fractured column and peeked down into the newly exposed structure. That's when he saw it. A towering silhouette, 10, maybe 12 feet tall, formed from a grotesque combination of human muscle, reinforced bone, and grafted armor plating that glistened like wet obsidian. Its face was hidden behind layers of fused metal and sinew, but two blazing amber eyes burned through the dust, glowing with terrifying intelligence. This wasn't a mutation. This wasn't a failed experiment. This was the apex creation. The one the valley answered to. The one the hunters obeyed. Subject Zero was coming out, and Jalen Ward was standing directly in its path. Jalen's breath stalled in his chest as Subject Zero stepped fully into the fractured light. It wasn't simply large, it was wrong. Its body moved with a horrifying blend of mechanical precision and predatory instinct, each motion too fluid to be metal and too controlled to be flesh. Strands of reinforced muscle twitched beneath armored plating, glowing faintly with pulsing veins of energy that looked almost alive. Its footsteps shook the canyon floor, each one sending a low tremor through the ground like the valley itself was reacting to its presence. Dust swirled around its massive frame, catching in the amber glow of its eyes. Those eyes, they weren't wild like the broken experiments or calculating like the hunters. They were something else. A mixture of intelligence, pain, and an uncontainable fury that made Jalen's skin crawl. Subject Zero turned its head slowly, the movement disturbingly smooth, scanning the shattered valley. For a moment, its gaze lingered on the mountain ridge where the hunters had fled. A low growl reverberated in its chest. Not a roar of rage, but something deeper, almost disappointed, as if its creations had failed it. When its gaze finally swept toward Jalen's position, he ducked behind the column, heart hammering against his ribs. The air buzzed with tension, buzzing like static electricity. He risked a quick glance. Subject Zero crouched, placing a massive hand on the ground. The earth vibrated under its palm. Jalen could feel the pressure through the column at his back. Was it listening, tracking vibrations, sensing movement? He held his breath completely, fearing even the thud of his pulse might give him away. The creature stood again, towering higher as it sniffed the air. A deep, rattling exhale escaped through the vents in its fused mask. Jalen understood instantly this thing could smell him. It wasn't hunting by sight or sound alone. It was following scent trails left by Falcon Echo, by the survivors, by anyone who had ever bled in this valley. He needed to move before it detected the fresh blood soaking through his bandages. Slowly, carefully, he shifted back from the column, keeping his steps silent. His mind raced. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't fight it head-on. He needed strategy, terrain advantage, something to level the impossible. Subject Zero suddenly snapped its head toward the canyon's northern wall, letting out a fractured roar that rattled Jalen's bones. The remaining cliffside shook violently, and an avalanche of rock slid down the slope. Jalen took the distraction and darted into a narrow crevice between collapsed structures, fighting through debris until he dropped into a lower corridor, half buried in rubble. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, and pain shot through his shoulder, nearly blinding him. But he forced himself upright. Above, the colossal footsteps of Subject Zero thudded against the earth, pacing, searching. The corridor he'd fallen into was part of the bunker. Rusted pipes dangled overhead, some leaking coolant that hissed against the hot air. Broken lights flickered, casting erratic shadows along the walls. Old warning signs, biohazard, containment breach, termination protocol, peeled from metal panels. This place wasn't just a lab. It was a prison, a cage built for something they never truly controlled. Jalen backed deeper into the corridor, tightening his grip on his rifle. The bunker's labyrinth of halls might be the only place where Subject Zero's size worked against it. If he could outmaneuver the monster, find the command center, pull the hard drives, records, anything, he could expose everything. He could make sure Falcon Echo didn't die forgotten. He could tell the world what happened here. Another earth-shaking roar tore through the bunker, shaking dust loose from the ceiling. Subject Zero had found the entrance, and now it was coming inside. Jalen steeled himself, heart pounding with terror and defiance. This was no longer a mission. This was a race between truth and annihilation. Jalen moved deeper into the bunker's maze-like interior, every step echoing faintly through the corridor like a reminder that he didn't belong in this place. Not alive, at least. Broken pipes hissed overhead, releasing thin streams of vapor that hung in the air like ghostly curtains. The walls were lined with thick cables, some severed, others sparking weakly, and metal panels warped by heat or brute force. As he pushed forward, the low ceiling dipped enough for him to duck, forcing him to move slower than he wanted. He kept one hand on the wall to steady himself. The other gripped his rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. Somewhere behind him, deeper in the bunker, Subject Zero's massive footsteps echoed like rolling thunder. Each impact shook dust from above and made old pipes rattle in terrified protest. Jalen listened closely, trying to track its position, but the sound bounced down every corridor, making it impossible to pinpoint. That thing wasn't just in the bunker. It dominated it. Turning a corner, he stumbled into a long hallway lined with reinforced glass rooms. The panels were cracked and fogged with age, but inside he could still make out the horrors left behind. Desks covered in dust. Computers smashed beyond repair. Chairs overturned as if abandoned in a panic. And along one wall, a series of containment chambers, each one large enough to hold a grown man. Some were empty. Others still contained remnants of restraints, torn apart from the inside. One chamber held faded scratches on the glass, forming words smeared by a trembling hand. "Let us die." Jalen felt his stomach twist. He pressed forward, refusing to stop. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant imagining what had happened to the men who once clawed those words into the glass. He reached a heavy blast door partially ajar. Its locking mechanism melted into a warped mess. Something, likely Subject Zero, had forced its way through. Jalen squeezed his way inside and found himself in what once must have been the command center. Banks of shattered monitors sat against the far wall, blinking with sporadic bursts of static. A large terminal lay toppled over, wires spilling out like exposed veins. The room stank of burnt electronics, blood, and chemicals that made his eyes water. But something caught his attention immediately. A small server rack still powered, flickering weakly with a single blinking green light. The backup generator must still be feeding it just enough energy to function. Jalen rushed to it, dropping to one knee. His hands flew across the dusty control panel, ignoring the shaking in his fingers. He didn't know how long he had before Subject Zero tracked his scent here. He needed to extract whatever data he could: logs, video feeds, research files. Proof. His brothers didn't die in a valley ambush. They were executed to conceal a nightmare, and the world needed to see it. As the machine whirred to life, slowly pulling encrypted files onto a portable drive he'd salvaged from another console, Jalen heard a sound outside the door that froze his blood. A deep inhale. A massive, deliberate breath dragging in air through metal vents. Subject Zero was close. Very close. The lights flickered violently as the monster's shadow stretched across the hallway outside, growing larger and larger. Jalen yanked the drive free even though the transfer wasn't complete. Partial files were better than none. He shoved it into his vest and scrambled behind a fallen cabinet just as the blast door groaned. Subject Zero's enormous hand curled around the metal frame, bending it like soft clay. Jalen held his breath, gripping his weapon as the room darkened under the creature's shadow. He found the proof. Now he had to survive long enough to reveal it. The blast door screeched as it bent inward, metal groaning under the unstoppable force of Subject Zero's grip. Dust rained from the ceiling in thick streams, coating Jalen's hair and shoulders as he crouched behind the toppled cabinet. His pulse hammered so violently he feared the creature might hear the blood rushing through his veins. He forced his breath shallow, quiet, measured. One mistake, one sound, and it was over. The shadows shifted as Subject Zero's towering frame squeezed through the partially destroyed entrance, its massive shoulders scraping sparks from the warped doorway. When it stepped fully inside, the temperature of the room seemed to drop instantly. Its presence drained the air of warmth, filling the space with a suffocating, predatory pressure that made Jalen's lungs tighten. Subject Zero paused in the doorway, head tilting as it surveyed the destroyed command center. Its amber eyes flickered like molten metal beneath the fused mask. Then it inhaled deeply, slow, deliberate, searching. Jalen's heart lunged into his throat. The creature was tracking scent, hunting the air currents for the signature of living flesh, for the blood soaking his shoulder. It turned its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it took another deep breath. A low, guttural vibration rolled from its chest, rattling the shattered screens around the room. Jalen pressed himself flatter against the floor, willing himself into stillness. The creature moved deeper inside, heavy footsteps shaking the ground with each step. Its massive hand brushed across a desk, sending papers fluttering. It examined the room with a frightening level of intelligence, pausing at computers, broken equipment, places where dust patterns had shifted. It was reading the environment, analyzing every disruption. Jalen realized with growing horror that this thing wasn't just a brute. It was a hunter designed to think. Subject Zero drifted closer to Jalen's hiding place, its immense shadow stretching across the floor until it swallowed his boots. Jalen's breath halted completely. He tightened his grip on his rifle, not because he planned to fight, but because instinct demanded he hold on to something, anything. If the creature took one more step, its foot would land inches from his hand. The monster paused again. It leaned down slightly, scanning the room at a lower angle. Jalen watched dust swirl around its snout as it inhaled slowly, tasting the air. A single bead of sweat rolled down Jalen's cheek, landing silently onto the floor. That was enough. Subject Zero snapped its head toward the sound with terrifying speed. Jalen's body reacted before his mind did. He rolled out from behind the cabinet just as the creature slammed its colossal arm down, obliterating the metal barrier into twisted shards. The impact shook the entire room. Jalen scrambled to his feet and sprinted toward the far hallway, pain blazing through his shoulder like fire. Behind him, the monster let out a roar so powerful it sent a shockwave through the corridor. The blast hurled Jalen forward, smashing him into the opposite wall. His vision exploded with white sparks. Still, he forced himself upright, stumbling forward. Subject Zero barreled after him, its footsteps thunderous, relentless. Jalen raced down the hallway, dodging falling pipes and collapsing panels as the bunker shook violently under the creature's pursuit. A metal door ahead hung off its hinges, an exit leading to an auxiliary corridor. Jalen dove through just as Subject Zero's arm crashed into the doorway behind him, tearing half the frame away in its attempt to reach him. Jalen hit the ground hard but rolled onto his back, weapon raised. Subject Zero snarled, ripping at the doorway, trying to force its massive form into the narrow passage. The metal walls groaned, bending under its strength, but not enough. The corridor was too tight. For the first time, Jalen saw it, a flicker of frustration in those molten eyes. He didn't hesitate. He turned and ran deeper into the winding auxiliary tunnels, clutching the drive with the valley's truth pressed against his chest. He wasn't safe, but he was still alive. And as long as he kept moving, the truth was too. The auxiliary tunnels twisted like veins through the earth, each bend tightening around Jalen like the narrowing throat of a beast. He ran with everything he had left, boots pounding across cracked tile and gravel, one hand gripping the portable drive against his chest as if it were a second heart. The air grew hotter the deeper he moved, thick with dust and the metallic tang of old blood. Behind him, the distant thunder of Subject Zero's frustration echoed through the bunker. Metal tearing, stone collapsing, roars that made the walls tremble. Couldn't fit into the narrow tunnels, but that didn't make Jalen safe. The creature was forcing new paths open, ripping its way through the bunker wall by wall. It was hunting him with the brute force of a monster and the precision of a machine. Jalen stumbled into a wider chamber that looked like an old break room. Tables snapped in half, lockers pried open, vending machines gutted. A few emergency lamps flickered weakly above, casting sickly yellow light across the space. He took a moment to catch his breath, leaning against the wall as sweat poured down his face. His shoulder pulsed with every heartbeat, threatening to drag him into unconsciousness. But he pushed the pain down. Pain meant he was still fighting. Pain meant he wasn't dead yet. He needed an exit. Any exit. Jalen scanned the room and spotted a maintenance hatch near the far corner, partially concealed by fallen debris. He hurried toward it, grunting as he shoved aside a collapsed metal shelf. Beneath it, the hatch door was intact but rusted shut. He dug his fingers under the edge and pulled. The metal groaned but didn't budge. He tried again, teeth clenched, using every ounce of strength he had left. Finally, with a shrill metallic snap, the hatch popped open, releasing a gust of stale, cold air. Behind him, the chamber lights flickered violently. Jalen froze. The floor under his boots trembled. Not from footsteps. This was deeper, heavier, like the bunker itself groaned in pain. A booming crash echoed through the building. Then another. Subject Zero was breaking through the bunker's internal walls, bulldozing its way toward him. Jalen dropped into the hatch and slid down the ladder, wincing as each movement sent agony ripping through his injured shoulder. He reached the bottom and found himself in a tight service conduit lined with pipes. The air was wet and cold. Water dripped steadily from overhead valves, gathering in shallow puddles at his feet. As he stepped forward, something metallic clattered in the darkness ahead. Jalen aimed his rifle instinctively. A weak voice echoed from the shadows. "Don't shoot!" Jalen's breath caught. He moved closer, raising his flashlight. There, slumped against the wall, was a soldier. American. His uniform shredded, his body bruised and bloodied. He looked like he had crawled here, every inch of him trembling with pain. A patch on his chest confirmed the impossible. He was from one of the units reported missing years ago. Jalen knelt beside him. "You're alive," he whispered. The man coughed, flecks of blood staining his lips. "Not for long." He grabbed Jalen's wrist with surprising strength. "Listen, you have to get out. You have to warn them." "I know," Jalen said. "I have the proof." The man shook his head weakly. "Proof won't matter if that thing gets out." His eyes filled with desperation. "They didn't just create it, they gave it a failsafe. If it escapes the bunker, the valley goes with it. Everything. Everyone." A shiver ran through Jalen. What kind of failsafe? The man swallowed hard. A self-destruct protocol. Buried under the main chamber. Manuals, triggers, detonators. All still down here. Jalen felt his breath stall. "You're saying this place can be destroyed?" "Yes," the soldier whispered. "But only from inside." Above them, a roar shook the tunnel so violently that dust rained down from every pipe. Subject Zero had found the conduit. Jalen met the dying man's gaze, and the soldier nodded once, with the final flicker of strength he had left. "End this," he whispered. Then his hand fell limp. Jalen looked up the dark tunnel, jaw clenched, heartbeat deadly calm. The truth was not enough anymore. To honor Falcon Echo, to protect the world, to end the nightmare, he had to destroy the valley itself. Jalen closed the fallen soldier's eyes with a trembling hand, letting the silence settle over the cramped conduit. For a brief moment, grief almost crushed him. Falcon Echo, the survivors hiding in the valley, the broken experiments carving desperate symbols in the dark. And now this lone soldier, forgotten, buried alive in a nightmare the world had never been allowed to see. Jalen felt the weight of all of them pressing into his ribcage, threatening to break him. But he forced himself up, gripping the portable drive tighter against his chest. Proof wasn't enough anymore. Exposing the truth wouldn't matter if this valley and Subject Zero escaped into the world beyond it. This had to end here. With him. He pulled the map from his vest and flipped to the section marked with deep red ink. The central containment chamber. That was where the detonators were stored. That was where he had to go. The conduit rumbled behind him. Subject Zero's roar burst through the tunnel, warping the metal and sending shockwaves through Jalen's bones. He sprinted forward, boots splashing through shallow puddles, turning sharply through intersections marked by old warning signs. The deeper he ran, the louder the alarms became, motion sensors tripping from Subject Zero's pursuit. Emergency lights flickered erratically, casting the hallway in violent flashes of red and white. Jalen slid around a corner, nearly slipping as a secondary quake rippled along the floor. Pipes burst overhead, spraying cold water across his face. The noise was deafening. The tunnel behind him collapsed in a cascade of stone and steel, Subject Zero tearing through it like tissue paper. Jalen pushed through a rusted door at the end of the passage and staggered into a massive chamber. The ceiling stretched high above him, lined with catwalks and rusted machinery. and at the center of the room sat a cylindrical console encased in reinforced glass. Its interior filled with old explosive charges and a large manual lever that connected to brittle-looking detonation rods. This was it. The failsafe. The mechanism that would collapse the entire valley into itself, burying Subject Zero, the experiments, the bunker, everything. Jalen's chest tightened. Pulling that lever meant there would be no time to escape. No way out. This was a one-way mission. He approached the console slowly, his reflection fractured in the cracked glass. In that reflection he saw his mother's face, his childhood, his unit laughing around a campfire, Cross's hand on his shoulder, Hughes humming nervously before missions, Mendez showing pictures of his newborn daughter. They hadn't died for nothing. Not anymore. "This is for you," Jalen whispered, his voice thick with emotion. A deafening crash shook the chamber as Subject Zero burst through the opposite wall, shards of concrete spraying across the floor. Its amber eyes locked onto him instantly. Jalen didn't hesitate. He slammed his fist into the emergency release panel, shattering it. The glass around the detonator split open. Subject Zero roared. A sound of fury, desperation, maybe even fear. Jalen grabbed the lever with both hands. The creature charged. Jalen pulled. Light exploded beneath the valley floor. A chain reaction surged through the bunker, heat flooding the chamber like a rising sun. Subject Zero lunged, its massive form inches away as the entire world detonated in a blinding flash. The valley rose. The earth split. The mountain roared. And Sergeant Jalen Ward, last survivor of Falcon Echo, ended the nightmare that had claimed so many before him. When the dust finally settled, the valley was silent. Truly silent. No patrols. No screams. No experiments in the dark. Just a massive crater sealing everything beneath it. And near its edge, buried under earth and debris, lay the shattered remains of a portable drive. Its data fragments still intact enough to tell the world the story of what happened here. Jalen died a soldier, but he became something greater, a man who chose truth over survival. A man who saved the world by sacrificing everything. A black soldier whose name would no longer be erased. If you've stayed with this story until the end, thank you. Stories like Sergeant Jalen Ward's remind us why the truth matters. Why the courage, sacrifice, and resilience of black soldiers should never be buried, forgotten, or erased. If you want more powerful, emotional, and cinematic stories like this one, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. And before you go, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Your support helps keep these hidden histories alive, and I'll see you in the next story.